Okay, first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Roy Coachill, broker owner of YourMortgageYourWay.ca, and today we're doing something a little bit different than we normally do. I have Giancarlo Stafidis, owner of Fairside Homes. He's a small builder in the city, and here we're talking about affordable housing and what is actually the background of developing. Giancarlo, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Roy, and I'm glad you made a pretty good effort at my name.
And he's going to talk about things that really affect the housing market today, like affordability and the supply issues that we're having today. And I think it's very important that we all get to know what happens in the background. So, Giancarlo, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning, Roy.
Good morning, Giancarlo.
As you noted, I am the owner of Fairside Homes. I also sit on the board of directors of BUILD, the Building Industry and Land Development Association, and I chair the Government Relations Committee for the Renovator Council of BUILD.
So what does that mean? The reason why I say that is that's some big long titles, and I just want to know, what does that mean for you? Like, why are you here today? In the sense that what do we want to discuss here?
Well, I think today we're here to talk about the issues of affordability in the Toronto or GTA housing market, and why a lot of millennials are finding it so difficult to get into the market. And that's as a result of government policy throughout the years, and it's going to take its toll on affordability. If you want to protect green belts and if you want to protect the environment, there's a cost to that, and we're seeing that cost play out today. The industry talked about this 15 years ago when green belts and places to grow acts were first being deliberated and contemplated, and we said the consequence is going to be a lack of supply. And at the end of the day, this lack of supply has finally caught up to us, and that's why homes are becoming increasingly unaffordable.
So when it comes to the affordability of houses, we all know there's costs involved. And one thing we talked about the other day on the phone is the cost of developing a piece of land into residential.
Okay, and I'm glad you bring that up, Roy, because this is something that the public should know. The development charges that municipalities levy are staggering these days. So what does that mean? So when there's a piece of land that a developer wants to develop, the developer will provide their plan of subdivision, how the land is to be subdivided, what's going to be built. And for every lot that is created, every lot now, so you could have conceivably development with 200 homes. So for every home, the builder's going to pay a development charge, they're going to pay an educational levy, they're going to pay parkland in lieu levies. There's a whole host of charges that are staggering. So our survey, our estimates suggest that for single family detached homes, these fees total a little under $122,000 per home. And for condo units, it's about $124,000 per unit.
So it costs more for a condo?
Yes. It costs more for a condo because, they're concentrated. And this is a real head scratcher, because at the end of the day, what does that mean? These fees are being collected ostensibly for the provision of infrastructure, sewers, water, schools, that kind of thing. But what does that mean? That means the new home buyer has a disproportionate burden in bearing the cost for those services, because those development fees weren't around when your parents bought their homes, certainly nowhere near to that proportion, and even afterwards. So today, the municipalities are using these charges as a backdoor way of taxation. And let's be frank about it. The new home buyer is suffering. This is one of the factors that's making homes increasingly unaffordable.
Now, do you think that these certain levies should be charged? Or are they just is it just an exorbitant amount they're charging now? Is there something that is there a good balance between how much is too much, basically?
Yes, and there needs to be. At the end of the day, industry is more than willing to pay a fair share of charges for infrastructure, for parkland development, for schools. But let's take the example, Roy, where we think of these things as public goods. So if it's a public good and everybody benefits, for example, everybody benefits from sewers on Finch Avenue, even if you don't live on Finch Avenue.
Of course.
Right? Everyone benefits from the fact that we have a fire department. Even if you never have to call the fire department in your life, you pay for it. Same thing with schools. If you have no children, you're still paying for the school system. So what we're saying is these fees that are being collected for infrastructure and for parks and for schools, they need to be spread amongst the largest possible base. And a far more equitable way of doing that is through property taxes, because everyone pays for that. But at the end of the day, we understand that governments are a little reticent to increase property tax rates because it's a political question. So what they're doing is they're allowing municipalities to front load more and more and more the cost of these services, which is fundamentally unfair to the new generation of home buyers. And it's not reflective of the benefits to all of society. So like fire departments and police departments, those costs need to be spread amongst the largest possible base, and they're not right now.
Right. So one thing I want to ask you is, how is this going to affect the future of people purchasing? Because we all know that that's just a small portion of making it, housing unaffordable. What about things like supply? Like, how long does it take for somebody who buys a piece of land and decides, look, I want to develop this into 500 homes so I can house, several thousand Canadians? And we're finding that more and more difficult nowadays. But how long does it take for somebody to actually go from purchasing land to building houses to house Canadians?
And that's an excellent question, Roy. And that's one of our concerns with the level of speed in regulation. And what do I mean by that? It can take up to 10 years to get approvals for low-rise developments, up to 7 years for high-rise developments, which is astounding. You have to remember, in the GTA, there's about 120,000 people that move in here every year. We need to build about 55,000 homes just to keep pace with that. We're nowhere near that. So when we talk about supply, this is what we mean. So what needs to happen is the government, both provincial and municipal, let's sit down and look at this together. What are the issues here? Why does it take so long to get permits? Why can't we pre-zone land? Why don't we have infrastructure in place in anticipation of housing? And that's easy enough to do. We know where the public transit corridors are going. Why don't we start thinking about what kind of infrastructure needs will be along those corridors? Why not pre-zone land? That's one thing. The second thing, perhaps which might hit a little closer to home with a lot of people, is if you have say a small bungalow and you want to increase the size of the house, you have a growing family, you don't want to move out, you like the neighborhood. Why does it take 6 months to get a committee of adjustments hearing? The whole process, we did a study for doing a simple add-on to the house, and our conclusion was between the zoning certificate that will be needed to identify variances, and if you have variances, and if you have to go to committee, and then the appeal period and the permits, it would take you about 48 weeks to get a building permit. That's unconscionable. At the end of the day, if the city is the only provider of permits, in other words, you can't go anywhere else, you have to follow the process in place, the city needs to do a better job of making that whole process a little more transparent and can certainly expedite it.
Now, I know that you're a small builder, you do a lot of infills in the city.
Correct.
And I understand that a lot of times it's happening, and I do a lot of financing for small builders. And I'm finding that more and more that they get these large lots that they have one house on and they want to develop into 2 lots, they're getting now pushback from neighbors. So there's called NIMBO or
NIMBYism,
not NIMBYism,
yes.
but it's not my backyard.
Right.
But don't people realize that this actually benefits the neighborhood and it benefits the people in the city? And shouldn't the city allow you to basically double the housing?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Roy. In light of the fact that there is a shortage of housing, that more and more people are coming into the city, we're trapped in this whole concept of NIMBYism. People want more housing choice, more affordability. And when we try to do that, we always go up against NIMBYism. Yeah, I like this house. And I'll give you a classic example. I severed a lot to build 2 houses where one was. And you know what the neighbor said to me? He said, these are going to be beautiful houses. They're wonderful houses. I just don't want them beside me. And that set it off for me. And I said, why not? Well, because it's just going to be too much house beside me. And we were left shaking our heads. So what ends up happening is the provincial government has these policies in place for intensification or to increase density. And this is a provincial policy statement. And then when you go and try to comply with that in our own way, obviously, we get resistance, and the municipalities aren't really doing anything to back that up. So we're being caught in NIMBYism. So we're doing kind of the, if you will, we're doing the work of the provincial government in implementing these provincial policy statements with very little help, because all we get is resistance from neighborhoods. And we're not talking about putting high rises in established neighborhoods. You know, that's not what the conversation is here. Obviously there are guidelines that the Planning Act provides for, but you know, if you want to build a pair of semis where one house was and it's zoned accordingly, we shouldn't meet that kind of resistance. And let's talk about zoning briefly. I think it's time to update antiquated zoning bylaws. Let's recognize the fact that this city today is not the city it was in the 1950s when these zoning bylaws were written. So
Agreed.
Let's update them. It's time.
What do you think about land assemblies? And we see them happening in certain neighborhoods where they assemble older homes to put up high rise, because of course in the downtown core, supply is super tight, and we need to add more housing. And I noticed that you see these land assemblies, they have a big sign there and they sit there for years.
And that's indicative again of how long it takes to go through the process. I told you it's not uncommon for low-rise developments to take about 10 years to get the necessary approvals. And that's, so what does the city want? Does the city want to meet the need for housing and housing choice? It's not just supply, but we also let's increase the housing choice available. Not everyone wants to live in condos. As a matter of fact, there's a new survey out, and I think it was Ryerson that did the study that said over 60% of millennials still prefer single-family homes. But the condos are necessary to try to meet this demand in housing.
Don't you think that also with condos, I mean, they put a mandate that they have a certain amount, there are 3 bedrooms, right? And 2 bedrooms in condo buildings. And I find that instead of actually creating an actual 3-bedroom that is family friendly, they just took a 2-bedroom and added a very small 3rd bedroom to it. Is there not something that builders can do to make high rise a little more family friendly, so that people have more choice than just a 1-bedroom den or a small 2-bedroom?
Absolutely, and this is where the industry needs to work hand in hand with the municipality and with the provincial government to say, look, we need more housing choice. If we want 3-bedroom apartments, nothing comes for free in this life, Roy. That's one thing I think we all learn at an early age.
Yes.
So accommodate the industry, right? Saying, okay, we'll give you a density bonus. If you build so many 3-bedroom units, so many family-friendly buildings, we'll increase the density. We'll allow you to build 45 floors instead of 42. Right? I think that's the way you get around it. I think no one stakeholder has a universal solution. These solutions have to come when all parties are at the table. And we want to talk about affordable housing. We want to talk about inclusionary zoning, which is on the city's agenda now. We're not against these things. At the end of the day, people have to remember we live in the communities that we build, and we want to see thriving, complete communities.
Right. And now, we were talking about time it takes to build and get your permits in place. So let's say for a high-rise condo, you should take 7 years to get the actual approvals in place and the plans in place.
It's not uncommon, that's right.
And then it takes another 7 years to build it. I find that's what seems to be the track record, another 7 years. So you're talking about a 15-year cycle. Do you find it would be beneficial to everybody around us if the city can cut that time in half, so you can build twice as much housing and take this pressure off the supply? I find that even on the mortgage side of things, they're making it tougher for everybody as well. Like, they're making it tough for investors to finance, so there'll be less rentals out there. They make it more difficult for people to finance, so people can't purchase in, especially with the new MQRs, people don't qualify. Right. And then, you take away the self-employment programs, so everything becomes a little bit more difficult, which puts pressure again, because if you can't buy, you need to rent. But yet, is anybody doing anything to help maybe add bonuses for purposely built rentals, or allow people to go into neighborhoods where they have single-family dwellings and create high-density 4, 5, or 6 plexes that allow people to rent?
And you've got a whole series of excellent questions there, so let's try to take them apart one by one. With respect to rentals and new rentals, I think the conversation is beginning now. I think the city is beginning to look at the necessity for new rental developments, and perhaps providing some types of incentives to builders for that. So that's encouraging. You talk about let's say the increased regulation in your sphere of mortgage lending, and we see that. But at the end of the day, having acknowledged what you said and how difficult it is to obtain a mortgage, we have to also acknowledge that at some point in time, it would have been natural for the housing market to take a breath. Now, did these new regulations exacerbate that process? Yes. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. I think the market had to slow down. I think 2017 was an anomaly, and I think we all acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
When you have less than 600 homes for sale in the month of January of 2017, I think we know what that will do to the market. Again, it's a question of supply and demand. The demand will be there, particularly when we've already said there's going to be over 100,000 people coming to the GTA year in, year out. The millennials, again, there was another article not long ago saying that there's this entire groundswell of about 700,000 millennials who are ready to buy. But the new regulations are making it onerous for them to be able to afford a mortgage. So at some point, that's going to play out as well. So let's talk about increasing supply. Like I said, when the government introduced Places to Grow Act and the Greenbelt, laudable initiatives from an environmental standpoint, they had to recognize that if you don't build out, people are going to build up. And that makes things far more expensive. It makes the process take a lot longer, and it decreases not only supply, housing supply, but housing choice. That's why we're talking about putting 3-bedroom units and playgrounds in buildings right now. So these are some of the consequences that we need to address. But yes, regulation is stifling right now. It should not take anywhere near as long to get approvals because it benefits all quarters of society. And it's not, Roy, I want to emphasize, it's not an us versus them argument. It's not big bad industry wanting more, looking for more. No, we're trying to, at the end of the day, accommodate the demand that's coming. People come to the city, they need places to live, and the industry wants to supply those places in concert with the city. Let's have reasonable regulation that doesn't take inordinate amounts of time to get through.
Anyway, Gerald, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
It's always a pleasure. We could talk for days.
Absolutely. So we're going to post this on social media. We'll make sure that everyone knows how to get some information from you if they need to. If there's some websites, we'll post that all up there. And I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us today.
Thank you for having me, Roy. It's been a pleasure.
All the best. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching.